Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On the morning of March 19th, 2004, a 911 call came into the Farmersville Police Department, a small agency servicing a rural town in East Texas. The caller was a middle-aged woman, panicked but composed enough to say what mattered. Her daughter was missing, her infant granddaughter was alone, and the back door had been left wide open. Officers were dispatched to 605 Bois d'Arc Street, a modest one-story house in a quiet residential block. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows. The door had not been kicked in or tampered with. It was just open. Inside, a 6-month-old girl was found lying in a crib, sweaty, dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. There was a cell phone on the nightstand, a half-packed diaper bag on the floor, a baby bottle that had long since gone cold. There was no sign of Rochelle Tolson, 20 years old. A missing persons report was filed. But anyone familiar with these cases, anyone who's read enough field reports, knows the first 24 hours tell you everything you need to know. And what was there, in that empty house, was more revealing than what wasn't. The sheets on Rochelle's bed were slightly askew. Her purse still hung on a chair. Her car was parked out front, keys inside. No signs of struggle, no obvious indicators of foul play. But it didn't add up. Detectives took immediate notice of the crib's position. It had been rotated away from the window, odd considering the layout of the room. The child's pajamas had traces of soot and an earthy smell. That detail didn't make the initial report, but one patrol officer noted it later in a private memo. The backyard was examined. The grass had a slight depression near the garden shed, not deep, not fresh, but it stood out. One of the responding officers remarked in his log, "It didn't feel like a disappearance. It felt like someone hit pause on her life and forgot to press play." The case was handed over to the Texas Rangers within 48 hours. No ransom note, no call, no signs she had planned a trip, a relocation, or a visit. Her social media, minimal for the time, showed no red flags. Phone records indicated normal use up until 11:42 p.m. the night before. After that, silence. The house was sealed as a crime scene. A formal timeline was established. Rochelle had been seen by her mother around 6:30 p.m. the previous evening. She had talked on the phone with a close friend at 8:15 p.m., sounding calm but tired. She had reportedly put her daughter to bed at around 9 p.m. By all measures, it had been an ordinary night, except she never woke up. The early investigation focused on friends, ex-boyfriends, neighbors. A recent house party was brought up multiple times by witnesses. Approximately 15 people had attended, including individuals not closely known to the family. Detectives noted one repeated name. He had no prior criminal record. He wasn't a boyfriend or relative. He had been at the party, stayed quiet, and left early. A blip, barely remembered. But in the absence of hard leads, even a blip can become a shadow. Forensics began collecting samples from the child's crib, the living room, and the backyard. Swabs were taken from the doorknobs, light switches, and baby bottle. A preliminary luminol sweep came back negative for blood traces. But something else came up. In the kitchen sink under a plate and coffee mug was a men's wristwatch, waterlogged but ticking, not listed among Rochelle's belongings. No prints, no inscription. Brand, Armatron. Estimated retail value, $30. Useless, except it wasn't hers. The Rangers ran the serial number. It was sold in bulk to a discount retailer 3 towns over. No buyer information. Still, the presence of that watch, in that sink, in that home, it was enough to widen the aperture of suspicion. That evening, the Rangers canvassed the neighborhood again. One resident, a retiree, mentioned seeing a figure walking through the alley between 1 and 2 a.m. He couldn't identify them. Male or female, unclear. But they were carrying something, a large object, like a rolled-up carpet or maybe a tarp. The man didn't report it. "Didn't seem my business," or he later told a reporter. "This is Texas. People carry weird things at weird hours. And that's the thing about quiet towns. People don't look until it's too late." By the third day, Rochelle's face was on local news. Flyers went up. Volunteers searched the nearby woods. Her phone remained off. Credit cards untouched. No contact from her. No contact, period. In the early stages of a missing person case, the critical task isn't finding answers. It's eliminating noise. Farmersville PD had a list of names within the first 12 hours. Co-workers, family, recent acquaintances, anyone seen near 605 Bois d'Arc Street in the last 72 hours. By the third day, that list had narrowed, and one name quietly repeated itself, not shouted, not accused, but present. That name was Moises Mendoza. On paper, Mendoza was unremarkable. 19 years old, high school graduate, occasional work in landscaping, no criminal record, not listed in any restraining orders, no known history of violence. But he had been at the party, the one held just days before Rochelle disappeared. The guest list wasn't formal, but multiple attendees recalled seeing him, sitting alone, nursing a beer, making small talk with no one in particular. One witness described him this way: "He was there, but not there with anyone." Rangers interviewed all confirmed attendees. A few mentioned that Mendoza had seemed out of place. One said he left early. Another said he didn't say goodbye. One remembered him standing too close to the kitchen door, watching people instead of talking to them. That detail wasn't alarming in itself, but when paired with the wristwatch found in Rochelle's sink, an item traced to a discount store in a neighboring town, investigators noted Mendoza had shopped there recently, based on a scanned loyalty card transaction from late February. There was no proof the watch was his, but it wasn't anyone else's either. The problem wasn't the data, it was how neatly it was falling into place. Mendoza had no documented interactions with Rochelle beyond being at the same party. They weren't close friends. They hadn't dated. But according to a co-worker of Rochelle's, she once referred to a guy from school who gave her weird vibes. The co-worker couldn't recall the name, but it was noted in the case file. Another layer surfaced from a surveillance poll. A convenience store less than a mile from Rochelle's house had an outdoor camera facing the road. Footage from 1:17 a.m. on March 19th showed a lone figure walking eastbound, grainy, low resolution, but seemingly male, and dragging something indistinct behind them. The image was inconclusive, but the timing lined up. Digital forensics requested access to Rochelle's call logs and messaging history. Her last outgoing text had been to a friend around 9:32 p.m., mentioning her daughter had finally fallen asleep. No incoming messages after 9:45 p.m. Her phone remained stationary in the house until it powered off at 11:42 p.m. The battery hadn't died. It had been manually shut off. That was not routine behavior. Mendoza's phone, by contrast, pinged two towers, once in downtown Farmersville at 10:10 p.m., then a second tower near Lake Lavon just after 2 a.m. Rangers found that movement unusual for someone who claimed to have been asleep all night. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to tighten the lens. Investigators visited Mendoza's residence. He lived with his parents, maintained a mostly reclusive lifestyle. When questioned, he denied seeing Rochelle after the party. He confirmed he had left early. He didn't recall what he did afterward. He said he probably just drove around. No search warrant was issued yet, but the interview was recorded, cataloged, and flagged for follow-up. A short time later, Rangers received a call from a local tip line. The caller didn't give a name. They didn't identify themselves as a friend or witness. They simply said, "You need to look behind the property on Leonard Road. There's something there." That property was less than half a mile from Mendoza's home. And this is how these cases often progress. Not in dramatic bursts, but in quiet alignments. Statements that don't contradict, but don't match either. Items that don't belong, but have no rightful owner. A name that keeps appearing, not as a suspect, but as an anomaly. In towns like this, it doesn't take much to go unnoticed. And sometimes that's all a predator needs. 6 days into the investigation, the town of Farmersville was already adjusting to a grim rhythm. Porch lights left on past midnight, community volunteers combing ditches, helicopters circling fields that had never known crime scene tape. The search for Rochelle Tolson had not gone cold, but it was shifting. Missing persons cases only hold that status for so long before law enforcement reclassifies them based on evidence, not hope. On March 24, 2004, a property owner off Leonard Road contacted the sheriff's office after finding charred debris near the edge of a dry creek bed. It was tucked behind a cluster of trees at the boundary between private land and public easement. At first glance, the scorched area looked like remnants of an illegal trash burn, common in rural Texas. But mixed in the ash were fragments that didn't belong in any burn barrel, part of a blue fabric strap, melted synthetic material, and what appeared to be a human molar. Local deputies called in the Texas Rangers immediately. Forensics were deployed on site the same afternoon. A controlled perimeter was established, and evidence was secured before sundown. Rangers identified heat patterns in the surrounding soil and partially melted metal consistent with a high-temperature fire, likely fueled by accelerants. Soil samples were collected. The vegetation around the site showed chemical burns, later confirmed to contain traces of gasoline and motor oil. Roughly 6 feet from the burn area, beneath a collapsed tree limb, they uncovered skeletal remains, scattered, some partly calcined. The condition of the remains indicated post-mortem burning. A forensic anthropologist was called to the scene and began preliminary identification. Young adult female, consistent with the age and size of Rochelle Tolleson. By nightfall, investigators retrieved over 85% of the skeleton. Several bones displayed sharp force trauma, deep, clean incisions near the cervical vertebrae and clavicle. That detail was sealed in internal reports for now. The next morning, dental records confirmed what many already suspected. It was Rochelle. The coroner's office noted the cause of death as homicidal violence, including but not limited to ligature strangulation and sharp force injuries. A plastic zip tie had fused to one of the cervical vertebrae. The hyoid bone was fractured, consistent with manual strangulation. DNA testing of charred tissue yielded a match with Rochelle's mother. Forensic timeline reconstruction became a priority. The burn area's thermal signature suggested the fire occurred between 2 and 4 a.m. on March 19th. That aligned precisely with the last recorded movement of a suspicious figure seen on nearby surveillance footage, and with the cell tower ping from a phone traveling west from the Tolleson residence toward Lake Lavon. Also retrieved at the scene was a scorched but partially intact zipper tab marked Graco, a brand associated with infant gear. Investigators linked it to a diaper bag missing from Rochelle's home, strengthening the probability that the victim was taken directly from the residence, with belongings in tow. A single brown hair was recovered from a charred sweatshirt sleeve near the remains. Initial DNA testing returned a partial male profile, not belonging to any family member or known friend. It was preserved for future comparison. Law enforcement began cross-referencing burn area access routes. Only a narrow dirt trail led into that part of the woods, barely wide enough for a compact truck. Tire tracks were photographed, casted, and analyzed. Tread patterns matched off-road light truck tires, size LT245 7516, used commonly on older Chevy and Ford pickups. With no direct eyewitnesses and no forensic match to a known offender yet, the investigative focus shifted to proximity and opportunity. Residents within a 2-mile radius were re-interviewed. Anyone with a truck matching the description or seen on Leonard Road that night was subject to further scrutiny. And once again, the same name surfaced. Not through accusation, through adjacency. No one had seen him out there, but his family's property line ended just under a mile from the burn site. The week following the recovery of Rochelle Tolson's remains brought the investigation into a new phase. Targeted confrontation. The tone shifted from community canvassing to controlled pressure. Evidence now pointed to premeditation. The location of the burn site, the use of accelerants, the concealment, none of it fit a spontaneous crime, and the list of individuals with both access and motive continued to narrow. On March 26th, a supplemental interview was conducted with a former classmate of Rochelle's who had attended the party at her home days before she vanished. She had not come forward initially. Her statement was recorded at the Collin County Sheriff's Office and transcribed the same afternoon. In it, she described a moment during the party when Rochelle appeared visibly uncomfortable with someone in the room. She did not name the person, but recalled Rochelle saying, "I hate when he stares like that. He always does that." The witness claimed she had dismissed it at the time. When pressed further, she provided a name. It was not new to the case file. but it gave a behavioral context that hadn't yet been documented. That same afternoon, investigators received an anonymous voicemail routed through the department's tip line. The voice was male, altered electronically. The message was short: "He burned her with her stuff. You'll find more near the tree line south of Ridgewater." Ridgewater Road bordered undeveloped property and a cluster of abandoned outbuildings near a now-defunct quarry site. Investigators dispatched a forensic field unit and a K-9 search team. About 800 yards into the brush line, partially buried beneath broken concrete slabs, they recovered personal items that had belonged to Rochelle: scraps of a wallet, partially melted plastic baby toys, and a section of fabric with a floral pattern matching a blouse confirmed by her mother as one Rochelle had recently worn. The items were degraded but intact enough to verify origin. Soil samples were taken. Latent fingerprint processing yielded one partial thumbprint on the inside of the wallet lining, though insufficient for automated database match. It was preserved for manual comparison. A search warrant was prepared that evening for the residence of the subject identified in the latest tip and interviews. Before it was served, investigators conducted a second voluntary interview. The individual in question denied having seen Rochelle after the party. When shown photos of the Ridgewater recovery site, he stated he had never been back there and had no reason to go into those woods. But a review of his prior police contact record revealed a misdemeanor trespassing warning from 3 years earlier, issued on the same abandoned quarry property. During the interview, officers noted the subject displayed visible agitation when questioned about the fire. He paused for several seconds before answering, looked off camera frequently, and at one point stated, "I didn't do anything. I wasn't there. You guys don't know what she was like." That quote was entered into the investigative file without comment. Within 48 hours, the warrant was approved. During execution of the search, investigators collected clothing, footwear, and several pairs of gloves from a shed behind the house. One pair of boots was consistent in tread pattern and size with the impressions recovered near the burn site on Leonard Road. Soil embedded in the outsole of the right boot was taken for comparison. Preliminary chemical screening showed high levels of petroleum residue. Inside the home, investigators also seized a notebook with handwritten entries. Among them were rough sketches of the wooded area, including 2 X marks corresponding roughly to the creek bed and Ridgewater tree line. The relevance of the drawings was not publicly released at the time. Forensic specialists logged the items and entered them into evidence under sealed chain of custody documentation. At this point, there was still no direct DNA match to the body site, but circumstantial evidence had become structural. Opportunity was established. Proximity was consistent. And now, for the first time, language suggested an element of pre-crime awareness. In many investigations, the mistake isn't in the act, it's in the aftermath. At this stage of the investigation, the forensic facts had outpaced the suspect's statements. Contradictions weren't inferred, they were recorded. Timeline inconsistencies were no longer minor gaps. They were deliberate omissions. The person at the center of this growing web of evidence, Moises Mendoza, now required closer psychological evaluation, not to excuse the crime, but to understand how it unfolded in silence. Background checks revealed Mendoza had no felony convictions, but he wasn't unknown to police. In 2001, he was flagged for truancy and cited twice for trespassing. Both times he was found alone, in wooded areas near vacant properties. No charges were filed. His school record showed repeated disciplinary referrals for inappropriate language and hostile behavior, including a documented incident in which he cornered a female student in a stairwell. She never filed a formal complaint, but the incident was written up. Those behavioral snapshots didn't confirm guilt, but they filled in the emotional blanks. Socially isolated, reactive under pressure, and quietly volatile. When behavioral analysts from the Texas Department of Public Safety reviewed Mendoza's interrogation footage, their assessment was clear. He didn't display guilt. He exhibited control. Pauses between answers were not because he was searching for truth. They were calibrated. His eye contact was inconsistent, but not panicked. When asked direct questions, he often answered by reframing the context. "You guys don't know what she was like." That kind of deflection, they noted, often masks a deeper self-rationalization. Investigators revisited Mendoza's online activity. While not prolific, his browser history included searches for how to burn evidence, chemical accelerants, and forensic fire detection. These were time-stamped 1 week before Rochelle disappeared. Cached files on his hard drive showed offline access to survivalist forums discussing remote disposal and combustion temperatures. Digital forensics confirmed no malware or planted files. This was not an impulsive act. The pathology deepened when a psychological profile was constructed using the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP tools. Mendoza aligned with what analysts classify as a controlled disorganized offender, a type that plans the crime but reacts poorly to deviations in execution. He likely had intent prior to the night of the disappearance, but the violence escalated when the plan didn't go smoothly. According to the profile, he didn't bring a weapon. He used what was available. That's why the strangulation appeared improvised, but the cleanup was methodical. He returned to the burn site more than once. That behavior was not defensive, it was habitual. Serial offenders often revisit scenes not out of remorse, but to verify control. The coroner's follow-up report further clarified the timeline. Based on internal tissue damage and bone fracturing patterns, Rochelle likely died between 1 and 2 a.m. The level of thermal degradation on the remains, combined with wind data and heat dispersion analysis, confirmed the fire was reignited approximately 45 minutes after it was first set. That matched the movement logs from Mendoza's cell phone, which pinged back near the site again just before 3 a.m. He didn't panic. He returned to finish the job. When questioned again about the items recovered at the Ridgewater location, Mendoza denied knowledge. But fingerprints on the notebook seized from his shed were matched to him, and 2 of the sketches inside aligned with GPS-coordinated photos taken by the forensic field team. The marks weren't abstract. They were instructional. The turning point came when soil samples from the soles of the boots taken from Mendoza's shed were chemically matched to samples at both dump sites. Not similar, identical. Same mineral ratios, same chemical contamination from the fire accelerants. That evidence closed the loop. In training, investigators are taught that some offenders act out of emotion, others out of entitlement, and a few out of fixation. Mendoza didn't lash out in a moment of rage. He prepared. He took steps to avoid detection. He studied. There's no comfort in that. But there is clarity. By mid-2005, the investigation into Rochelle Tolson's death had produced a fully developed evidentiary structure. The prosecution didn't need speculation. They had physical data, digital trails, and consistent behavioral patterns. It was enough for a grand jury to return an indictment for capital murder. What followed wasn't a show trial. It was the procedural unfolding of a case where the facts no longer whispered. They spoke. The trial opened in Collin County District Court under strict media protocols. Jury selection was completed in 5 days. The defendant, Moises Mendoza, appeared calm. Observers described him as disengaged but not confused. He faced charges of murder with aggravating factors: kidnapping, sexual assault, and destruction of a human body with intent to conceal a crime. The state was seeking the death penalty. In its opening argument, the prosecution presented a straightforward theme: opportunity, intent, and execution. There was no reliance on emotional appeals. Instead, they committed to a timeline built from cellular tower pings, forensic fire analysis, digital evidence, and recovered physical material. The jury was shown side-by-side images of burn patterns from the Ridgewater dump site and the primary disposal area by the creek. Fire investigators testified about the presence of petroleum-based accelerants and thermal anomalies consistent with a reignited fire. They explained how the intensity of the second burn required a return trip, something only the perpetrator would have had reason to do. The defense did not contest the timeline. Instead, they questioned the interpretation of intent. Their strategy rested on suggesting Mendoza was emotionally immature, socially alienated, and not capable of premeditated homicide. They pointed to his age, 19 at the time of the murder, and introduced a psychological evaluator who testified to cognitive inflexibility and underdeveloped impulse regulation. But the prosecution had already anticipated that. The next day, they introduced search history logs recovered from Mendoza's computer. Jurors heard testimony from a digital forensics specialist who verified that the searches for body disposal and fireproof accelerant were not part of spam scripts or phishing malware. They had been manually typed in over the course of 3 days, 1 week prior to Rochelle's disappearance. Next came the soil analysis. An expert from the Texas DPS Crime Laboratory explained how trace soil from Mendoza's boot matched not just general geography, but the exact chemical signature of a petroleum-contaminated patch found beneath the scorched remains. Elemental composition tests matched levels of manganese and vanadium, a rare combination that narrowed origin to within a 200-meter radius. This wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. Forensic pathologists then detailed their autopsy findings. The jury was shown diagrams, never the full images, illustrating ligature compression on the hyoid bone, consistent with strangulation. Burn damage had partially obscured some trauma, but sharp force wounds on the clavicle were unambiguous. One of the most methodical witnesses was the lead Texas Ranger. He recounted step by step how the case unfolded, from the missing person call to the final search warrant. His testimony was not emotional. It didn't need to be. He spoke in clear, sequential logic, pausing only to ensure jurors understood the chain of custody for every piece of evidence. At one point, he stated, "The subject did not cooperate during questioning. He did not deny the existence of the fire. He only denied being responsible for it." That distinction became critical. Rochelle's family was present throughout the trial. They did not speak publicly. Their presence did not prompt outbursts or reactions, but the weight of what they represented, a young mother taken, a child left behind, never left the courtroom. On the 10th day of testimony, the defense rested without calling the defendant to the stand. Closing arguments began the next morning. The prosecution reminded jurors that evidence, not personality, defines guilt. That human behavior, no matter how cold or quiet, leaves patterns. That Rochelle had no history of instability, no reason to vanish, and no contact with Mendoza outside the party he attended uninvited. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. At the sentencing phase, victim impact statements were allowed. Rochelle's mother read from a single page, briefly recounting her daughter's life. The prosecutor then presented a final argument for capital punishment, citing the deliberate, calculated nature of the crime and the defendant's lack of remorse. Mendoza received the death penalty. He did not respond when the sentence was read. There were no headlines the next day outside of local media. But in Farmersville, where people still remembered porch lights being left on for a girl who wouldn't come home, there was a quiet resolution. Not peace, but closure. The verdict didn't end the case. It only started the next phase. Following Moises Mendoza's conviction and death sentence in 2005, the case entered post-conviction procedure, where legal finality and emotional closure rarely align. Automatic appeals were triggered by Texas law. Defense attorneys filed motions questioning the admissibility of certain forensic materials, specifically the boot soil match and the relevance of internet search history. None of those challenges introduced new evidence. They sought reinterpretation. The Court of Criminal Appeals of Texas reviewed the case file in 2007. Their conclusion was concise. The original trial adhered to procedural standards. The evidence was sufficient. No retrial was granted. Still, Mendoza's legal team pursued federal habeas relief. They cited ineffective assistance of counsel, arguing the defense had failed to secure a deeper psychiatric evaluation. In 2012, that claim was rejected. The judge stated that no evaluation, however extensive, would have altered the material strength of the case. Each motion delayed the timeline, but not the outcome. In 2015, Mendoza's attorneys requested DNA retesting using newer mitochondrial tracing methods. The Texas Forensic Science Commission reviewed the protocol and found no justification for reinvestigation. The DNA evidence, while limited, had been corroborative, not central. The conviction did not rest on a single strand. Meanwhile, Rochelle's family continued to live in the same town. Her daughter, now a teenager, was being raised by her grandparents. She wasn't part of public interviews. She didn't attend hearings. But her name appeared once, in a victim's statement filed in 2017, where her grandmother described the effects of raising a child born into loss. That document became part of the permanent appellate record. By 2020, nearly every route of appeal had been exhausted. Mendoza remained on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit, showing little interaction with other inmates and no significant behavioral incidents. He submitted one final clemency petition in 2024. It was denied without a hearing. The execution date was set for April 23, 2025. In the weeks leading up to the sentence, no public demonstrations were held. There were no high-profile opinion pieces or clemency campaigns. The case had never become a symbol. It remained exactly what it was, the prosecution of a calculated, targeted killing in a small Texas town. On the night of the execution, Mendoza made no final statement. His last request was declined due to facility restrictions. He was pronounced dead at 6:31 p.m. by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. No one from his family was present. Rochelle's mother issued a written statement hours later. Justice was delayed but not denied. My daughter didn't get to say goodbye. Neither did we. But at least now, she can rest. From a legal standpoint, the case was now closed. But that closure didn't erase the timeline from the files. It didn't change the procedures that followed. And it didn't alter the quiet way Rochelle's photo still hung inside the hallway of the sheriff's office, next to a small plaque that reads, "Don't wait to listen. One look can be a warning." At 5:22 p.m. on April 23, 2025, Moises Mendoza was moved from his holding cell at the Huntsville unit to the execution chamber. The walk took less than 2 minutes. He declined a spiritual advisor. He declined a last meal. His face showed no outward tension. The media witnesses later noted that he blinked often and looked straight ahead but spoke to no one. He was strapped to the gurney without resistance. The intravenous lines were secured in both arms. The room was quiet, clinical. At 6:14 p.m., the warden asked if he had any final words. Mendoza replied, "No, sir." The lethal injection was administered at 6:15. He was pronounced dead at 6:31 p.m. Outside the prison, no protests were recorded. No family members attended on his behalf. One correctional officer later told internal review staff, "It was like he'd already left that place days ago." That night, Rochelle's mother released a written statement. It didn't speak of revenge. It spoke of exhaustion. This wasn't closure. It was conclusion. We won't celebrate. We'll breathe. Legally, the case was now closed. The evidence catalog had been archived. The crime scene photographs sealed. The boots, the notebook, the burned fabric, every item that told a piece of the story now sat in a storage room in Collin County marked Homicide 2004. But the final chapter of a case like this never stays inside an evidence box. At 21 years old, Rochelle's daughter had never spoken publicly about the crime that shaped her life. Raised by her grandparents, she attended school in a nearby district under a different surname. She declined media requests and never gave interviews. But she appeared once, briefly, at a community panel hosted by the Texas Coalition for Victims' Families in late 2024. She stood at the back. She didn't speak. Her presence alone was enough. Detectives who had worked the case still remembered her as an infant, sweaty, crying, alone in a crib while her mother's absence echoed louder than any alarm. The same officers saw her years later, quiet but standing upright in a room full of people who understood what silence costs. In 2025, a memorial plaque was installed in the hallway of the Farmersville Police Department. It bore no photograph, just a line of text. "We investigate so others may live unafraid." The case had shaped policy discussions across Collin County. Law enforcement training modules now include a section on non-escalated threats, emphasizing how not all predators raise alarms. Some just stand at the edges of rooms and wait. A retired ranger who had testified in the case said it plainly, "We missed it early. He was right there. We just didn't know what we were looking at yet." That's the human failure in cases like this. Not malice, not incompetence. Delay, underestimation, the cost of not acting until harm becomes irreversible. But some lessons stick. Farmersville High School now hosts a peer intervention program. Local law enforcement partners with social workers. Early signals are reported, not dismissed. Rochelle Tullison's name no longer lives on headlines, but it is known, and in quiet policy shifts, in silent decisions to speak sooner, in one photo still pinned to a hallway wall, she remains part of the system she never got to rely on. Some crimes close with a verdict. Others echo, quietly, precisely, until we decide to listen sooner next time. What happened to Rochelle wasn't just a crime. It was a warning that danger doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, from those we barely notice. If there's one thing I've learned walking through this story with you, it's this. Always trust your instincts, speak up when something feels wrong, and never underestimate small signs. They might be the only chance someone has. If this story moved you or made you think differently, let me know in the comments where you're watching from or what part hit hardest. And if it didn't resonate, I still want to hear why. If you found value in this video, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real-life case that matters.